Hello there, I'm Sanj from Inclusive Magic, and you're listening to Koanversation, a podcast featuring Zen nuggets to free your mind and inspire new thinking. This is episode 3, and we're dealing with the third koan from the gateless barrier, which is called Gutei's finger. My guest today is someone who's always been a real inspiration for me, someone who's had the courage to forge her own path. My cousin, Priya Sudarsanam. Priya grew up in the great state of New Jersey and worked in New York City as a speech therapist before taking the leap of moving to Gallup, New Mexico to do that work for children on indigenous American reservations. She's since started her own practice as an intuitive healer and mindful coach, and she hosts the really insightful YouTube podcast Unmuted with Priya. So, hi Priya, welcome, and it's great to have you here, Kaz.
Hi, Sanj. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited for this.
I was thinking about some memories, and one of my favorite memories is I was living in India in the late 90s. You were living in Japan for quite a while, and you came and stayed with us in India. I know that Japan has a very special place in your heart, and I was wondering, did you ever have any encounters with Zen?
Yeah, Japan, even though I lived there 1996 through 1999, it is still the most impactful experience in my life and still my second home. Okay. And so when I think about that, when I was in Japan, I know that I was searching for spirituality. I was searching what is spirituality because I didn't even know what it meant. And I know that being in Japan, I didn't even grasp temples versus shrines and Shinto versus Buddhism. And people were talking to me about Zazen and sitting in Zazen for hours and hours. And it was the first time that that word even popped into my head. I know that I had gone to a Zen Buddhist retreat right before I left in 99. And I went to one of the morning Zen meditations. And I was like, I'm going to die. I can't sit here for an hour. It was only an hour. I was like, what is this all about? Like, people just sit. I keep saying to people now, I wish I could have done that Japanese experience or the JET program as the person that I am today, because then that sitting an hour would have made total sense. I probably could have sat there for 3 hours, 4 hours, and it would have made sense. It just didn't make sense as a 20-year-old.
That sitting that is really what it is, because it's about being forced to be with yourself, be with your mind and its workings, and have some mastery of it. So I want to talk a bit about your new venture, Unmuted and Unmuting, because I think there it's a lot about understanding yourself and trying to not identify with some of the things that have, for whatever reason from experiences, become part of your thought processes, and peeling those back so you can kind of take a little bit more power.
You did mention my former lifetime as a speech therapist. I'm not really practicing anymore, but I have an occasional client here and there. But essentially what I did, and I didn't realize it, was as I worked with children, whether they had severe delays or handicaps that they were never going to be verbal, I found a way to help them unmute. I found a way to get them to communicate, whether it was turning their eyes to look in a certain direction if they like something, a smile. Even children who were completely nonverbal were able to, because they had vowel sounds, I had them saying hola. And that was enough to spark those neurons in their brains to fire so that they could actually start producing more sounds. So I've been doing it my whole life. And as things shifted, and, that started with a head injury, turning into my spiritual awakening and just 4 years of intense learning, it's morphed into Unmuted. The podcast is called Unmuted. My handles are Unmute with Priya, because that is what I do with people. When I'm working with them one-on-one or in a group, the essence and the intention that I set behind working with them is to help them unmute, help them to find those blockages within their body, the energetic, whether they're physical, whatever it is, unblock them, get them unstuck so that they can actually start unmuting. It varies for each person. For me, it's about speaking up. For other people, it's been creative writing. Other people, it's been gender identity and actually embracing that and showing the world who they really are. So that's been the direction that I would say that the universe has moved me in.
That's incredible. What you were saying about finding blockages in the body, I think we have tended to put an emphasis much more on just the brain, this like the cerebral mind, as it were, at the expense of how interlinked it is with the body. And there's that book, The Body Keeps the Score. There's this Zen master who I love, Charlotte Joko Beck. She wrote this book, Nothing Special, and it's all about if something triggers you, it's not about the thought that's in your head. It's about look for the blockage in the body, because that's the only fact in that moment. The thought is rationalization. So I think that's really powerful.
That book is one of my favorite books, The Body Keeps the Score, and that's essentially the basis of the work that I do. There is a place for traditional talk therapy, and there's a place for these other modalities which really help to shift you rapidly. So I think in my experience with just thinking about traumas and experiences in my life, talk therapy kept me in it. It just kept me talking about it. When I discovered these other modalities where you're working, at the somatic level, working with your body, talking to your body and having those conversations, that is what healed it. And it healed it rapidly.
One thing that I wanted to ask, and maybe, I don't know, this might take us off track, but it's just, obviously we're looking at an Eastern philosophy, one that you had your first exposure to when you went out to Japan. And, we are what I guess people call second culture kids, both born in the UK, but, and grew up in major Western countries, but obviously Indian backgrounds. In the work that you've been doing on yourself and with clients, like how much have you found that bridging two potentially very different cultural paradigms has played a role in things?
What I found was it was cultural constraints around being Indian, East Indian. I should just be able to say Indian, but out here in New Mexico, I have to identify myself as being East Indian.
Sure.
So when I say, it's something that I've picked up in the last few years that I think has become part of my speech. So anyway, it was more around the family being from Tamil Nadu and conservative Tamil Nadu, and if you want to even go deep, I feel like we could talk for hours on this, just our caste. And those are the things that I was raised around. And personally, it was oppressive. So, and it was the thing that muted me. It's taken me on all this time to, I want to say, sever that bond, but also keep me connected to it because it is my identity. And there's parts of it that I absolutely love.
It's like that sort of dependence, counter-dependence, and then independence, right? And I spend a lot of time in the counter-dependence stage and getting to that independent stage where you're like, I'm not threatened by this stuff anymore. And I take what's valuable, but I know that I'm secure enough in my sense of self with this. That's the hard part.
The thing that you just said is being secure enough within yourself to just be okay with yourself. And that's the unmuting process, getting rid of the stories, getting rid of the guilt and the shame, and just stepping into who you truly are. I don't regret any of the experiences I've had, whether, they caused me deep hurt or pain. I don't regret, because I wouldn't be in this place. And from this place, as I approach 50, I'm going to be able to support a lot of people. And I find myself supporting a lot of people who the message resonates with. And then when you do that, you give other people permission to be who they are. I think one of the things that, when a couple of years ago, I got my first tattoo, and when I came home, I wasn't asking for permission. I was getting it. And then I went to my parents afterwards, and my mom said, Dad said he's too old. He really wished he could get a tattoo. And I was like, let's go. It's almost Father's Day. And I went and I paid for his session, and he got a tattoo at 75, I think.
That's incredible. So that, there's that great song, Teach Your Children Well by Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young.
I love that song.
Yeah. And I feel like it captures so much, because I think the second verse is like, teach your parents well. You of tender years can't know the fears that your parents grew by. So show them with your youth they seek the truth. Well, anyway, I think this week's koan is quite relevant to a lot of what we've been talking about. All right, so this is Gutei's finger. Gutei raised his finger whenever he was asked a question about Zen. A boy attendant began to imitate him in this way. When anyone asked the boy what his master had preached about, the boy would raise his finger. Gutei heard about the boy's mischief. He seized him and cut off his finger. The boy cried and ran away. Gutei called and stopped him. When the boy turned his head to Gutei, Gutei raised up his own finger. In that instant, the boy was enlightened. When Gutei was about to pass from this world, he gathered his monks around him. I attained my Finger-Zen, he said, from teacher Tenryu, and in my whole life I could not exhaust it. Then he passed away. So Mumon, the author of the Mumonkan, of the Gateless Barrier, says, enlightenment, which Gutei and the boy attained, has nothing to do with a finger. If anyone clings to a finger, Tenryu will be so disappointed that he will annihilate Gutei, the boy, and the clinger altogether. And the Mumon's verse is, Gutei cheapens the teaching of Tenryu, emancipating the boy with a knife. Compared to the Chinese god who pushed aside a mountain with one hand, old Gutei is a poor imitator. So, before we had this, you texted me and said, I hope we're not just going to read the koan and you ask, what do you think of that? but, well, I want to ask, what's your visceral reaction to this?
I love that you're asking me that. I find that just visceral, that the first thing that comes to my mind, if we talk about what, like just tapping into our intuition, is just learning by imitation. I feel like it resonates with the message that we just were taught, like within our own families, that we're learning by imitation. And then as we're approaching these later years in life, it's like we're learning to deprogram ourselves from that imitation so that we can come into full living and presence. Mm-hmm. That's my reaction.
Yeah, I think there's maybe two questions or points in the koan that we could look at. And one is what is behind Gutei's behavior? And then second, how is it that the boy gets enlightened by what is basically a violent attack? So with Gutei, the koan says that he sees mischief and he responds to it. I don't know if I would see what the kid was doing as mischief. Like you said, you learn by imitation. You see this authority figure doing something. You copy it, right?
Right.
So Gutei made kind of he's kind of judgmental about what the kid was doing. He says on his deathbed that he learnt this finger thing from his own master. And I sort of suddenly thought, well, is he really the imitator? And he's been kind of doing this just because his master told him. He sees the kid doing it and he projects his own sense of being a fraud onto the kid and punishes him for it.
That is deep, because as I have it in front of me, I'm looking at it as we're talking about it, and it just is showing how things can just get passed on generation to generation. We just do it unconsciously without even being aware of it, because it's passed on and we think it's our normal. Mm-hmm. And that as it says here, in that instant, the boy was enlightened. What was he enlightened about? Was he enlightened that maybe he stopped the cycle? Or was he enlightened that he was aware that he was just imitating? It brings up a bunch of questions, especially because what it resonates within me is breaking ancestral patterns, breaking things that go way back, further than before we were even alive. And sometimes it ends with us to break the cycle, whether we're aware of it or not.
I think that's a really good point. I was going to ask this later, but I think let's dive into this now, which is really, if you're looking at childhood experiences that cause you pain, this kid's shut down by Gutei and the kid's hurt, but he finds enlightenment from it. And as you say, kind of, he doesn't take the bait and just pass it on. He breaks that cycle. And I wonder, when people start to understand how they've been shaped by painful experiences, you can stay in anger and blame for quite a long time, quite understandably. How is that process of going from that to a place where you're past it, if you want to call it forgiveness, but it might not even be thought of that way?
I think, and I'll speak from personal experience, there was just something that clicked within me, and it happened simultaneously with present moment awareness, knowing that this is all we had, death and urgency. And death can happen to any of us. It's not going to happen just to our parents just because they're older. It could be me in this moment as I'm on the call with you.
Well, I hope not. Yeah.
I hope not either. But this is all we have. Present moment is all we have. So in this place, and I was able to understand that, let's even just talk about hurts and traumas within my family and with my parents. I held them to a higher standard because they're my parents. But meanwhile, they were just kids having kids, and they were parented. And if I think back to my grandmothers, our grandmother, paternal grandmother, and my maternal grandmothers were married at 11. So this is where it's going back generation to generation, but it stops with me. And so when I was able to come to that understanding that they were just doing the best that they can in this given moment, given what they had been given, it just freed me. I didn't get all zen about it and be like, oh, they're okay. I had to go through anger. I had to go through all those real anger, but it passed quicker once I came to that understanding, and just also tying in with death and urgency, and that our time is limited here on this earth.
That's really well put. Also, just for listeners, if you can hear a dog barking, that's Azuki, who... call back to our first koan. Do dogs have Buddha nature? Yes, Azuki definitely does. So you're absolutely right. As a child, you see, you depend on people, you see them as an authority, and if they're acting a certain way, the meaning you can take from it can be very different to the fact that actually they were just a human being with their own pains and problems, and they acted a certain way that has nothing to do with you in a way. But you create a meaning, a narrative, as you said, a story that you tell yourself for eons until you finally realize that that's all it was. What's interesting here is I'll tell you Gutei's backstory. So where he learned his finger thing, there's another, it's not a koan, but there's another account of it, but he was in a monastery on his own. This nun walked in with a hat, but she said she'd take the hat off if he spoke a word of Zen to her, and he couldn't. He was like, I don't know what to do with that. So she was about to leave, and then she said, I'll stay again if you speak a word of Zen to me. And again, he was like, I don't know, I can't. So she left. And then that night he had a dream that someone wise was going to come and teach him. And the next day, this guy Tenru shows up, and Gutei explains what happened and how it vexed him, and Tenru's response was just to stick his finger up. And just as you pointed out, the description, the one-line description, the boy was enlightened, here Gutei was enlightened by this finger being shown him, and he decided to keep using it himself. So the boy kind of gets castigated as this imitator, but the question is whether Gutei ever really understood why he was using it.
That's pretty profound. Did he ever understand why? I mean, that's a question that we can all ask ourselves when we do something. Do we know why we're doing it? That's just about being mindful and present. And, even the other day, I was going to text somebody and I knew it was passive aggressive, but I gave myself permission to be passive aggressive. I said, I'm being consciously passive aggressive right now. And I am completely aware what I'm doing. Okay, I'm done. And it was just like, there's a difference between doing things unconsciously and when you're doing it with conscious, understanding that's what I feel like this whole journey is all about.
In your own podcast, you talked about reacting versus responding, and how you could just react, but then you're the one who's going to have to deal with the anxiety of it afterwards. How do you do that passive aggressive in a way that feels like responding rather than reacting?
So there's the part where we have to also accept that we're human, and that we have human things that we do. I coined the term, and I still use it to this day. All my friends know what I mean by it, spiritually la-la. And so, so it's just this place of being so spiritual and so Zen and so whatever you want to call it, that you stop being human and stop acknowledging that you have human reactions. When I sent that text, I didn't react. It just fulfilled a human need of mine that I needed to get a point across. The person responded to me. I was like, I knew that they were going to respond that way, but I needed to kind of say, hey, you said you were going to do this and you didn't. And the difference with reacting and responding is if I had reacted to it, I put an emotional charge to their response, and that would keep me in my own spiral.
So, let's dive into this thing about why is the boy enlightened by Gutei showing him the finger?
What could he have potentially understood in that moment? He lost his finger. Was it that in an instance things can change? So, be cautious about what you imitate? Or is it that Gutei raising his finger whenever he was asked a question about Zen, that just by the nature of his finger being cut off and then Gutei's turned around, has he just already understood that? Did that bring him into a place of understanding of what Zen, being Zen, or about Zen, what that is even about?
There's a quote from, a lot of people say this is Buddha apparently, but it's this idea that a finger pointing at the moon is not the moon itself. And a person who only looks at the finger and mistakes it for the moon will never see the real moon. And I wonder if the boy's imitating the finger because he thinks that the teaching is about the finger, or that the finger is the thing. And when he's lost, he doesn't have a finger anymore, and the teacher holds it up. It's like, now you see, it's not actually about the finger, kid. Maybe.
Yeah. And I'm also looking at it in the sense of attachment. What I study the teachings of, have you heard of Neville Goddard?
Yeah.
I love Neville Goddard's teachings, and everything about Neville Goddard is everything that's happening in the world around you. It's a simulation, is your mind pushed out. So that's something that's been empowering for me, is that to gain control of my thoughts, what was happening in my mind, because that was what was playing out in my actual life. So in this whole scenario, it's like, all right, Gutei keeps raising his finger whenever he's asked about a question. And so the boy has created this thing within his own mind. This is the simulation that's occurring. And now having his finger, yes, it's barbaric, but having his own finger cut off, now it's shifted his simulation. Like, this is the world pushed out.
It's almost like not seeing that finger there for yourself and then seeing the teacher have it. You need to kind of rethink your relationship to it, because you can't do that anymore. So you're going to have to come up with a whole new meaning for the finger.
You have to not be attached. It's this clinging to, oh, I know what's going to happen. I know what's going to happen. Here's the finger. I'm going to imitate it, and here Gutei it broke that attachment by doing something pretty extreme.
And then, having broken that attachment, the last time Gutei raises the finger, the boy can finally see what it actually means. Or he can see the thing that he can see the moon that the finger was pointing to, figuratively.
Yeah.
Just like there was the backstory of Gutei, there's also like a deleted scene, if you want to call it that, or like another version of this koan that throws some interesting elements to this. But so as the boy runs away, Gutei calls to him, and the boy turns around. Gutei asks him, "What is the Buddha?" The boy lifts his hand up and tries to stick up his finger, and he doesn't see the finger there, and he becomes enlightened. So in this version, it's not Gutei lifting up his finger at the end. It's the boy wanting to go for that instinctual thing, not having a finger there and realizing, oh, wow, I see there's no finger there. I understand now. It was never about that.
I think that could be related to so many different things in life, in our lives. It's like we create these stories in our minds, right? And we believe them. Understanding perception, understanding that things aren't so black and white. And I mean, we have all of these different things. This is everything leading up until this place where we're able to actually understand all these subconscious patterns that really just keep us tied up in the story, tied up in believing our own story. And then one day, it's almost as, for me at least, it was literally as quick as the finger to realize saying, oh, I don't know if that was ever true. That just might have been what I decided was true. And so then everything in my life was based around that belief. So, that could be simple as what that boy realized when his finger was cut off. Like, oh, wow. And it is that quick to pivot. Doesn't have to be a lifelong place of suffering.
Gutei assaulted him violently, and I think a lot of us, our response would be like, I'm going to go take revenge. I'm going to, a finger for a finger makes the whole world unable to touch type. I'm going to fight Gutei. But the boy doesn't react that way. As you said, it breaks the cycle. It's a very powerful thing.
And I see the word emancipating in Mumon's verse, like emancipating the boy. You're freed when you do things differently. You're freed when you wake up, and you're freed when you unmute. So if he's enlightened as a result of losing his finger rather than running off and screaming and reacting, he's created a new pattern for himself. He's free.
Okay, we'll take a break here for the song Finger-Zen Blues.
Pointing at the moon, but all they see from under the roof is just me. Not as I say or as I do. You've gotta laugh, but the joke's on you. Reciting a phrase that somebody else coined. You'll see me pointing, but they miss the point. Blood will show. Today it's a finger. I lift up a finger. I ain't got no finger now. Today lifts a finger. I lift up my finger. I ain't got no finger Now it falls due. Will you pass it on to someone new? Or can you stand to be the one who flies too close to the sun? They dump it on you and you could throw it back. There's even more power in cutting them slack. The blood will show. Gutei lifts a finger, I lift up a finger. I ain't got no finger now. Gutei lifts a finger, I lift up a finger. I ain't got no finger now.
Well, thank you so much, Priya, for joining me. This has been a really, really interesting conversation.
Thanks, Sanj. This was so much fun.
I'm so glad. For me too. People, please check out Priya's YouTube podcast, Unmute with Priya. The link's in the show notes. And if you've enjoyed this episode and wouldn't mind leaving a rating on whatever platform you use, that would mean a lot. For more Koantent, check out my Substack, Inclusive Magic, substack.com. And listeners, see you next time for another Koanversation.